Okay, so good evening, everybody. My name is Loan. I'm 17 years old, and I am a debater. And this is Jean-Michel. He is the co-founder of iDebate Rwanda. This is Sharif, and this is Isaac. And thank you all for being here, and we're glad to be here. Now, let's start the debate. The United States of America should intervene militarily to stop cases of genocide around the world. According to the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, genocide is defined as acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. As such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. In the past 150 years, tens of millions of men, women, and children have lost their lives in genocide. Millions have been tortured, raped, or forced from their homes. Just in the 20th and 21st century, we have had genocide in Armenia, Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, the Holocaust, and in our time, Myanmar. Because genocide is still an issue that affects millions of people around the world, we believe that the U.S. should intervene militarily to stop cases of genocide. First, we will defend the importance of military intervention, and secondly, we would also defend why we think the U.S. is the actor that needs to act. According to Gregory Stanton, a genocide scholar and president of Genocide Watch, a non-profit that aims at making genocide history, genocide is a process that develops in 10 stages that are predictable but not inexorable. At each stage, preventive measures can stop it. The process is not linear. Stages may occur simultaneously. Logically, later stages must be preceded by early stages, but all stages continue to parade throughout the process. These stages are classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, persecution, extermination, and denial. At each stage, preventive measures can stop it. However, when we have reached at stage number 9, which is when the killings have started, only a military intervention can function. At this stage, people are dying and we have no time for negotiation or debates. Extermination begins and quickly becomes the mass killing legally called genocide. It is the extermination to the killers because they do not believe their victims to be fully human. When it is sponsored by the state, the armed forces often work with the militias to do the killings. Already dead bodies are dismembered. Rape is used as a tool of war to genetically alter and eradicate the other group. All men of fighting age are murdered, and some genocides. In total genocides, all the members of the targeted group are exterminated. At this stage, only rapid and overwhelming armed intervention can stop genocide. Real safe areas or refugee escapes corridors should be established with heavily armed international protection. For larger interventions, a multilateral force authorized by the UN should intervene. If the UN Security Council is paralyzed, regional alliances must act under Chapter 8 of the UN Charter, or the UN General Assembly should authorize action under the Uniting for Peace Resolution GARs, which has been used 13 times for such armed interventions. Strong nations will provide troops to intervene directly. They will provide the airlift equipment and financial means necessary. The plan of the affirmative is that the U.S. military should create a unit whose sole mission is the prevention of genocide. This unit will be comprised of 20,000 soldiers, experts, and politicians who will work on all fronts to ensure that the genocide ends. This mission will be threefolded: to create safety zones for those escaping massacres, to provide humanitarian and medical aid to victims of the massacres, to defeat the militias that is killing people. Ladies and gentlemen, it is important that we understand that the affirmative does not think that the war is the best solution. Absolutely not. We believe that war creates more casualties and destruction. But in case of a genocide, where a group of people is intentionally being killed by the government, a military intervention is the only solution. We will also defend the fact that the U.S. is the only country that is equipped to do that. How? First, the UN is the only country in the world that has a military presence all over the world. According to the Pentagon, the U.S. has 800 military bases in more than 70 countries. And territories. And to give you a perspective, Britain, France, and Russia, by contrast, have about 30 bases, and that is combined. Secondly, where the U.S. goes, the world follows. We believe that U.S. intervention would provoke other countries to intervene because of not only America's hard power, but also its soft power. Ali Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor, said that what destroys the victim is not the attacks of the enemy, but rather the silence of their friends. The only way for us to ensure that we do not condone genocide is force the U.S. military to intervene to stop cases of genocide around the world. So in the end, if a country like the U.S. has the power to save lives, to stop one of the worst mankind crime, then we believe that this should be done for saving lives. And it is much more important than all other reasons why it shouldn't. Thank you.
So I'm Mackenzie Schroeder. I'm with UN-Flint debate team. I know I'd say everyone in this room now. I see people from my class, so thanks for coming today. I hope you really enjoy the debate. So getting my timer started. And again, thank you guys for coming out. We really appreciate it. It's nice to debate with a variety of teams around the country. This is our first time, I'd say, debating with a team out of the country. This year and last year, I don't remember doing that, so I think that's an awesome experience. So again, thank you for being here. Getting my timer ready. Okay. So on side opposition, we believe that the U.S. should not intervene militarily to stop cases of genocide. And before I go into my points of positive matter, I would first like to introduce two main pillars we are basing our arguments off of today. One being to avoid hegemonic power and attitude, and two being that the U.S. military is too dangerous in our current climate to act alone. So now going into my positive points of matter based off of these two main and crucial pillars, one being that unilateral action is bad, right? So the U.S. world peace is not okay. What their idea of world peace may not actually be world peace. Going off of this idea of the international relations theory of constructivism, the U.S.'s ideas don't necessarily, just because the U.S. has an idea doesn't necessarily mean it's correct, right? They can't go around pushing other countries and forcing their views on them because their views might not always be correct. And they might not always be well-formed and versed. For example, if we look at the case of the U.S. Starting war in Vietnam, the U.S. started war with Vietnam because the U.S. had believed that it was going to spread communism if we didn't intervene. They believed that Vietnam would merge with China to spread communism. However, the U.S. overlooked a few very crucial features of Vietnam. One being that Vietnam did not have the same form of communism as China. The two countries actually completely hated each other, right? So when the U.S. intervened, trying to bring about democracy and everything else great and golden that the U.S. believes to be their values, instead they just created a war where millions died, democracy wasn't even instilled, and it produced nothing but horror of war. So it's not okay for the U.S. to push their agenda on other countries because given that example, their agenda might not always be correct, it might not always be well-formed, and they might not have the facts to back it up. And my partner will get more into examples like that later because this is in the status quo. This isn't just one case that's out of the norm. Going into my next point, we believe that peacekeeping is better than military action. Now this goes back to our unilateral point, right? Because the UN is a multilateral organization with more countries that create balanced decisions. Again, when you're working with different countries on big decisions, you're able to go in with the best decision, right? Like, we agree that something needs to be done about genocide. We agree it's horrible and that countries should intervene. However, we just don't think one country needs to intervene as the unilateral power. We think this should be a myriad of countries working together to instill a sense of community. And again, going back to this Vietnam example, right, that military action, the U.S. acting alone in this decision, they made a bad call. A bad call that wasn't just a bad call, but killed millions of people, but you disagree.
You're saying the UN, the peacekeeping is better. Could you give us an example where the peacekeeping in case of genocide has worked better?
So we agree that in the case of Rwanda, that peacekeeping didn't work, right? We're just arguing based off of that fact that we think the military will be worse instead of peacekeeping with the examples we've given, which I will explain more later to that question. Which brings me to my next point, that the US military is not what it used to be. I think this argument we're seeing on Gov side is assuming that the US military will always make the best actions, or will always take the best actions if they're working unilaterally, and that they always will have the best decision in mind, at heart, whatever else, right? But like, again, through this Vietnam example, through Iraq and other situations, that's just not what's occurring. And especially in our current climate, with President Donald Trump as the commander-in-chief and us going down in hegemonic power, like we've actually probably been more trigger happy, right? Like we actually are creating more conflict. We're creating more tariffs against China and even places that we've actually been friendly with over the past few decades, like Canada. I was blanking on that for a minute. And again, like we're saying we don't want to foster this hegemonic ideal, right? Because if we let a country act unilaterally, that is fostering a hegemonic country and fostering this realism type of international relation order. However, what we see and what we see in the current climate is that as one country is getting stronger, as other countries that aren't the hegemon are getting stronger, that's creating tension and competition, and therefore that is going to get us closer and closer to war, and not something we're ready to risk, but my partner will get into that more later as I'm out of time. Thank you. I'm stuck on this.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jean-Michel, and I'd like to say I'm really excited to be here. This is the second time that I come here, and it's always a pleasure to be here. So I'd like to start this debate. So the debate tonight is whether the U.S. should intervene militarily to stop cases of genocide. And what I'm going to do in my speech is I'm going to basically look at some of the proposition that the opposition gave to you, or some of the criticism that they made of our case. The main two arguments that they're making is that, first of all, they're saying that unilateral action is not okay, and they're advocating for a peacekeeping option, or maybe a multilateral approach, which would mean to work through the UN. And then the second argument that they make is that if the US intervenes, then we're going to have, again, it's a problem of the US being a hegemony and all the negative impacts that come with that. I'd like to begin first by talking about the first thing that they talked about, how peacekeeping is better. I think that one of the things my partner said from the very beginning is that genocide goes through different stages. And when we have reached the ninth stage, which is the stage of the stage of extermination, where killings have already started, the problem with using a multilateral approach is, first of all, historically, we can see that that multilateral approach has not worked. There are many cases that could show us that. There is Rwanda. Rwanda is the perfect example of why peacekeeping has never worked when it comes to the UN. And then there's also the cases of Darfur, and there's also cases of different other genocide. There are even Myanmar that is happening right now, where it shows that the UN does not work, or the multilateral approach did not work. And the reasons why that multilateral approach does not work is because, first of all, it takes a lot of bureaucracy in order for something to happen. It takes a lot of work that needs to be done by different countries. So you have to convince different countries to participate, and then they have to decide on budgets. They have to decide on all of these different things that makes it so hard. But if people are dying, we think that however bad you might claim that the unilateral approach is, we think that it is the best because it's fastest. That's the first thing. And then there's less bureaucracy because then the US Army that's already, with the unit that we're proposing, it's already existing, then it will be easier for us to basically act and save lives. The other thing that we're going to talk about is that we're not advocating for war. None of us think that war is actually it's good. We actually say that when people are being killed, we need to intervene militarily. We propose a mission that has threefold. So the first thing is to protect, to have a refugee safety zone. And the refugee safety zones, it means that we'll create places that are going to be guarded by the US Army, where the victims of the crimes could actually go and they know that they will be safe. The second thing that we propose is a humanitarian aid and medical aid. It means that we're going to be treating people that are being targeted. And lastly, we talk about why it's important that we take out the killers. Now, here's the difference between a genocide, the case of genocide, and what they provided to you tonight. Tonight, they talked about Iraq. They talked about all the other examples that they could come up with. Those are examples that are driven by ideology. They're not driven by the fact that there's a genocide happening. So, for example, when we went, I mean the U.S. federal government, even though I'm not American, but when we went to Iraq, it was not because we wanted to stop any case of genocide. We went to Iraq because we had these ideologies that we wanted to promote. Wherever the U.S. has intervened in Afghanistan in different places, it was never because there was a genocide that was happening. But in a genocide, it's clear cut. It's not ambiguous. In genocide, it's the government that is killing its own people with the intent to destroy them. So it means that there we have a clarity that we don't get in other wars. So it means a lot of the impacts that they're talking about, a lot of the link that they're trying to show is there's actually no link, because all the examples that they give are not examples of U.S. intervening to stop cases of genocide, because genocide is a specific kind of crime that needs a specific kind of intervention, which we have already shown you. The next thing that they talk about is that basically that we have this idea that the U.S. is hegemony, and then that we have the problem with the current administration and all of that. We'll say that at the end of the day, that what is most important is that lives are being saved, right? Whether the U.S. is a hegemony, whether we think sometimes it might be a good thing, because the U.S. using its soft power, it means that it's going to stop a lot of the militias, a lot of the government have this fear of the United States. And we think that fear is actually very good, because it acts as deterrence and it stops them from actually killing their own people. So on our side, we're providing you with a new way that we could use the U.S. federal government or the military of the U.S. to stop cases of genocide by not only establishing refugee protection areas, also providing aid and medical aid and humanitarian aid, but also taking out the leaders. We think that the U.S. is best to do that because the U.S. not only has military bases all over the world, so it means that they can deploy the army really fast compared to going through the UN, which tends to be slower and more bureaucratic. And while they will be debating on whether genocide is happening, people will be dying. Thank you very much.
So I'd like to thank everyone for coming out. I know you guys have traveled a long way, and we really appreciate it. It was a great experience for all of us. My name is Brandon Hahn. I'm the co-captain of the Flint debate team, and I'm looking forward to continuing this really productive debate. Are we ready? So, oh, wait. I want to get the timer out. So to begin, I'm going to start with a few rebuttals and then move into my positive material. So right off the bat, in the very beginning of this first government speech, we get this implementable plan of create a new military branch of 20,000 troops and have it designated specifically for one thing. Now, the issue here, or not even the issue, but the problem with this argument is the fact that we already have the largest military in the world. So this would be an unnecessary branch to create, because we already have a military that is arguably the most mobilizable and quickest reaction military in the world. So if in a case where we did need to mobilize quickly, we'd be able to do that no matter what. So this would be unnecessary and more bureaucracy, which the government side does not like. So in addition, we keep getting this idea of unilateral, and all this stuff about how they want to be on military intervention, and that they want this three-pillar plan of zones and all this stuff. But I'd like to state that multilateralism can all implement these things, but better and more stable, which is what we on the opposition side want to express. And we have perfect examples of it where multilateralism works better. So an example, and I'll talk about this later as well, but in Iran, recently in the last 2 years, there was the case of the chemical warfare strikes on Assad had bombed his people with these horrifying chemical weapons. And these weapons, they do a lot of damage. They're very hard to help people once they are impacted by it. And the first response by the U.S. military, I will get you in just one moment. The first response by the U.S. military was to just unilaterally bomb them. This destabilized the region, made things worse, and actually put the rebels in more of a dangerous position. Later on, though, President Trump ordered a multilateral approach where countries came together and it actually suppressed the regime, made it so that it's less likely this will continue in the future, and actually benefited them. Yes?
So would a multilateral approach mean that there still is some sort of army intervention, or what would be the approach if we...
Yes. I'll get into that actually in just a moment. So we to move into my positive material, so we on the opposition side want to make it really clear that we believe that multilateralism is the best form of action, and that unilateralism breeds unpredictable outcomes, and that whether that is through peacekeeping or through military intervention, regardless, multilateral can implement this better and more stable and create a better outcome in the long term. So while we do think that peacekeeping should be our first priority, if we do get to that 9th stage where there is mass genocide, then yes, military intervention can still be deployed, but from a multilateral standpoint where everyone in the international community can come together and suppress this together, because that's going to create a stronger message, more deterrence, and stop those things from happening and quicker. So we want to make that clear that multilateralism can do all of the things the government wants, but better. And so that's why we on the opposition side are advocating for this. Going forward in the status quo, we also believe that the United States should seek a path without a hegemon, where the international community can come together and breed a new world order where we can stop international tragedies and stop these things faster and come together instead of the U.S. just marching in with troops without necessarily having all of the intel. We see this in Iraq, where we were basing information off of misperceptions and weapons of mass destruction, which led us into one of the longest wars in U.S. history. And while this isn't necessarily the same case for everything, and we understand that there is different outcomes and there is different scenarios for every war and every case, we do want to make clear, though, that multilateralism could have made this better. If we have a multilateral approach, we can do more, we can accomplish more, we can get it done in a more efficient way. The IR theory of liberalism, international relations, says that when we come together as an international community, we can get more done. It's a very founded and very supported theory in the United States that if we use international institutions as a first and not just a single institution, it works better. We'll get more out of it. As well as we can just look at the fact that when we, yes?
You keep claiming that it's multilateralism is better. Can you give us concrete ways in which we'll have better results? So what would that mean?
Right. So I spoke a little bit on my example with Iran, where it will lead to better outcomes. Some other examples can just simply put be the fact that once we have a multilateral approach, we can implement things faster, we can implement things in a more efficient way. We have more people on the ground, more boots, so we'd even have more than 20,000 troops because it's going to be a group effort. It also deters people and prevents it from happening in the future. Because when we work in the future, when we work in the status quo to create a multilateral approach, it yields a better outcome. And the thing that's important is, yes, there might not be hundreds of examples of multilateralism that have been successful because we haven't tried them. The United States has always been doing this unilateral, we're the best, we're the hegemon, we need to do everything on our own, we don't need the international community. And that's just a flawed ideology. The U.S. needs to promote multilateralism in the future, and I'm out of time, so thank you.
So I want to stress on opposition side of the House that we agree, like, working unilaterally is quicker. However, like, we're getting an assumption on the government side that, like, the U.S. will want to go in and help, right? But, like, I hate to admit it, but in the status quo we see, like, in World War II, when with the concentration camps in Germany and people were being systematically killed and murdered in the most horrific ways, the U.S. didn't intervene because they wanted to stop that, right? Like, they intervened because they wanted to stop the access. And I'm really ashamed that this is our country and that our country doesn't care enough to go in and save people who need saving, right? But, like, unfortunately, in the status quo, the U.S. just doesn't care about other people. So the U.S. isn't going to come in and save a bunch of lives. And yes, it would be great to, like, assume that the U.S. is going to intervene militarily and should, but the reality of the matter is it's not, and therefore we need to work multilaterally because That is when we're going to have a better chance of people intervening, different countries intervening and throwing supplies and giving all of these supplies to the people who need it, because that is going to produce the best outcome. Because again, unfortunately, in our current climate, the United States is not fostering a climate where it's welcoming to people outside of countries, right? Like, look at President Trump's recent words about the caravan approaching the border between Mexico and the United States, where he's basically saying to shoot them, right? Like, we are a country, unfortunately our government is, because I don't want to pair myself with this government in this case scenario, our government is the type where they don't care about other people that are being systematically hurt and killed and murdered and in bad situations, and that's shameful, right? So that is why I don't think it's okay to say the US should act alone and intervene militarily, because that's just not going to work with how the United States is in the status quo. Therefore, going back to this multilateral approach, when you have more countries getting involved, you're going to get more supplies, more troops, more money. We understand peacekeeping did not work in Rwanda. We understand that peacekeeping has not worked in certain situations, and that's why we're saying we will go militarily, and we agree, like, if we can speed that process up, that would be great. But if we're just relying on the US, nobody's going to be saved, rather than if we do it multilaterally, where it does take a little bit longer, that's going to save the most lives. That's going to create the safest environment for people, where they're getting the supplies they need and the support they need. And again, going back to this idea that being unilateral is quicker, yes, you are completely right. Unilateralism is a lot quicker. But again, like with a dictatorship, right? Like, that's quick, but the decisions they're making aren't always good. This is, again, assuming that the country that's the hegemon is making the correct decisions, right? Like, we see from the United States standpoint that the next rising hegemon in this current climate, we could assume will be China, right? But China is a communist regime that that suppresses their people in different ways. That's not okay, and there's going to reach a point where their ideology is going to be driving the global network as a whole, because we're seeing on government side this idea that, well, in only cases of genocide really are the examples we're giving on opposition side are not examples of ideology. But you have to keep in mind everything is ideology driven from a constructivist point of international relations. We went into Vietnam with the ideology that democracy is better. We went into Iraq with the ideology that democracy is better. That is an ideology. But I'm out of time, and therefore I'd like to say this is why I'm proud to support opposition.